Welcome to the Explainer. Today we're taking a deep dive into the beloved, yet surprisingly complex world of C.S. Lewis's Narnia series, right ahead of Greta Gerwig's highly anticipated Netflix adaptation. I am so incredibly excited to walk you through this because we're going to look at the very DNA of a series that has quite literally defined fantasy for generations. Here's our roadmap for today. First, the Netflix Narnia reboot. Then, mapping the fantasy realm, breaking down the archetypes and mythical characters, exploring allegory versus suppositional myth, controversies in the canon, and finally, adapting for modern audiences. Let's get right into it. Section 1. The Netflix Narnia reboot. We're starting with the absolutely monumental task facing acclaimed director Greta Gerwig, as she steps into the shoes of adapting these 1950s fantasy classics for a modern streaming audience. Just to put the stakes into perspective, we're talking about a series that has sold a staggering 120 million copies across 47 different languages worldwide over the last 70 years. So when Netflix scooped up the rights to C.S. Lewis's novels and tapped Gerwig, coming right off her massive success with Barbie, they basically handed her the keys to one of the most famous works of children's fiction ever written. No pressure, right? Making a faithful yet entertaining modern movie out of a legacy like that is an enormous hurdle. Section 2. Mapping the fantasy realm. Because to really understand the story, we first need to map out the physical world where all these epic battles and journeys actually happen. When you actually look at the data derived from the texts, the geographical realism of Narnia is, well, it's pretty surprising. The mainland of Narnia is actually kind of compact. It's about 90 by 60 miles, which is roughly the size of Montenegro. Compare that to the southern desert separating Narnia from the Kalarman Empire. Characters cross it via a 45-mile gorge, which, believe it or not, is a totally realistic travel distance for horses in a single day. And it gets better. Even the maritime voyages of the Dawn Trader are mathematically sound. Traveling 400 leagues in 6 days breaks down to sailing at just over 8 knots, perfectly accurate for a fast pre-modern ship. Lewis actually built a fantasy world grounded in astonishing geographical logic. Section 3. Archetypes and mythical characters. So, moving from the geography to the inhabitants, let's look at the foundational roles these beloved characters play in the narrative. To really get why Lewis's characters feel so instantly recognizable and impactful, we have to talk about archetypes. Basically, an archetype is a universally recognized character trope or situation. It's a psychological blueprint that represents typical patterns of human nature, allowing authors to connect instantly with their readers. Looking at the classic Narnia lineup, we can see these archetypes in action. Take Lucy, for example. She's the herald. She's the absolute catalyst for change, the very first to step through the wardrobe and kickstart the whole journey. Then you've got the Pevensey siblings sharing the hero role, going through some incredible growth. Aslan, of course, perfectly embodies the mentor, guiding the heroes until they can stand on their own 2 feet. The White Witch is our terrifying shadow, out for total chaos. But honestly, the most interesting one might be Edmund as the shapeshifter. His loyalties bounce back and forth early on, famously swayed by, you guessed it, Turkish delight. That shifting loyalty provides the main narrative conflict that sets the entire theological stakes of the story in motion. Section 4. Allegory or suppositional myth. Now, we're plunging right below the surface into the theological depths to explore how C.S. Lewis actually embedded his faith into the fiction. So is Narnia just a strict Christian allegory? A lot of people assume it's a direct retelling of the Bible, imagining Lewis sitting down with a checklist of Christian dogma and mapping it perfectly to a fairy tale. But actually, academic sources point out that Lewis himself entirely rejected that idea. There's a much more nuanced literary theory at play here. Here's the crucial difference. Lewis didn't write a rigid allegory. He wrote what he called a suppositional myth. See, an allegory is a strict one-to-one representation of what we already know, like matching the crucifixion exactly, detail for detail. A suppositional myth, on the other hand, asks a creative, hypothetical question. Lewis essentially said, okay, let's suppose there's a magical land called Narnia. What would happen if the Son of God entered that world as a lion? It's a subtle difference, but it allowed theological truths to naturally push their way into a fantasy setting, slipping past the reader's defenses without feeling like a strict Sunday school lesson. And this perfectly explains why Aslan's sacrifice differs structurally from the biblical narrative. Instead of dying for the sins of the entire world, Aslan dies specifically for Edmund. The White Witch invokes the deep magic, which is this ancient law demanding blood for a traitor. But Aslan,
He operates on the deeper magic from before the dawn of time, which represents divine grace and forgiveness. Because an innocent willingly died in a traitor's place, the stone table cracks, and death literally works backwards. It's such a brilliant way to demonstrate grace completely overriding ancient magical laws.
However, as academic journals point out, by the time we reach the final book, the Christian symbolism does become pretty overt. According to an analysis in the Journal of Language and Linguistic Studies, the last battle heavily mirrors the Book of Revelation's Armageddon. I mean, we see false prophets like Shift the Ape, deceiving the masses, there's a series of chaotic final conflicts, and ultimately the complete destruction of the old world before the faithful enter a new heavenly Narnia. It is a massive escalation from those earlier books. Section 5, Controversies in the Canon. Now we're hitting the deepest, murkiest waters. Let's examine some of the intense structural and socio-political debates surrounding the franchise. First up, there is a massive debate over the reading order. The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe was released first in 1950 and is pretty much universally considered the best entry point for the magic. But years later, Lewis actually stated that The Magician's Nephew, which came out in 1955, should be read first, because chronologically, it's the beginning of the world. So Greta Gerwig has a really tough call to make on where her Netflix universe actually begins. Then we have the infamous problem of Susan. In the final book, Susan is denied entry into the true Narnia. The text famously claims she's no longer a friend of Narnia, interested in nothing nowadays except nylons, lipstick, and invitations. Critics have heavily debated this for decades impartially. Some view it as outdated misogyny, essentially punishing a young woman just for growing up and discovering her sexuality. On the flip side, others argue it's meant to be a pure, genderless metaphor for someone losing their childhood faith, dismissing the spiritual world as just a silly game they played as kids. And the controversies don't stop there. Filmmakers will also have to navigate a surprisingly dark ending, where we actually learn the Pevensey siblings died in a train crash to reach Narnia. Plus, there are heavily scrutinized depictions of the Coloramine Empire, which many critics perceive as utilizing negative cultural stereotypes. And on a purely practical level, these books are really short. They lack the dense narrative filler you typically need to stretch a story into a massive, multi-hour Hollywood epic. Section 6, Adapting for Modern Audiences. Surfacing back to the present day, how might Greta Gerwig actually pull off translating these complex texts for the 2020s? Well, all of this builds one monumental adaptation checklist for Gerwig. Think about it. She has to stretch short children's stories into sweeping cinematic epics without them feeling padded out. She needs to update the old-fashioned, gee golly 1950s dialogue so modern viewers don't feel alienated, all while carefully patching up those outdated elements we just talked about. On top of that, she can't just shy away from the deeply rooted religious allegories because they give the story its soul. And she absolutely must find a satisfying way to resolve the highly debated fate of Susan Pevensey. Which leaves us with one really provocative thought to ponder as we watch this new universe unfold. Is it truly possible to modernize such a layered, controversial, and deeply beloved myth without losing the very soul that made Narnia a classic in the first place? It's going to be a massive tightrope walk between honoring an author's original, theological vision and updating the text for a drastically different modern world. I, for one, cannot wait to see how they pull it off. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey through the wardrobe, and I'll catch you on the next explainer.